Direct Connection is made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you. Live from Maryland Public Television, this is Direct Connection with Jeff Salkin.
Good evening, everyone. We begin tonight with answers to your questions about the war in Ukraine and the psyche of the person who started it. Joining us tonight are Professor Aryeh Kruglansky in the Department of Psychology and Vladimir Tismanyahu, Director of the Center for the Study of Post-Communist Societies, both at the University of Maryland. Gentlemen, we appreciate your taking time to join us. I'll start with the same question for both of you, beginning with the psychology department. In 2 weeks, Vladimir Putin has turned a prosperous petrostate into a global outcast. Why did he do it?
This is something that happened a long time ago, the beginnings of it, and have to do with Putin's personality. He is what in psychology we call a person who is very high on the quest for significance. In other words, he's extremely ambitious. You could see it when he replaced the portraits of Lenin and Kirov after the fall of the Soviet Union not with the new president Boris Yeltsin, but with Peter the Great, the portrait of Peter the Great. It's a kind of a portent of things to come. So he has been always very ambitious. As an agent of the KGB, officer of the KGB, he was used to cloak and dagger techniques and aggression. He saw aggression as the way to get things done. He himself has been quite aggressive. He's a judo black belt, judo champion of Leningrad in 1976. So, and he is extremely ambitious to restore Russia to its former glory. He was extremely offended by what he perceived as slighting of Russia by the West following the Cold War. The remarks by President Barack Obama that Russia is only a regional power, the slighting by President George W. Bush, who didn't visit him in the Kremlin, but let him trek to the airport terminal, and other expressions of the kind of disdainful, neglectful, arrogant attitudes, in his opinion, of the West toward him. And he is very much committed to Russian exceptionalism, to the restoration of Russia to the glory that once was. Russian Empire, of course, that for centuries, it was the third greatest empire ever after the British and the Mughal empires. And his ambition was to make Russia great again and thereby making Putin great again.
Professor Tismanyahu, the historical answer to that question of why.
Okay. Professor Kruglansky mentioned Putin as a KGB guy. Now, KGB means the Committee for State Security. Unlike many KGB operators and officers, young Vladimir Putin was not recruited into KGB. He volunteered to be a KGB functionary and so on. B, he was not in the domestic KGB, but he was in the foreign equivalent of the CIA versus FBI. Okay, so he always says, I was not involved in the persecution of dissidents in the Soviet Union because I was abroad. Where was he abroad? He was not in Netherlands, he was not in Luxembourg, he was not in Costa Rica, he was in the so-called German Democratic Republic, in the GDR, which was probably the most militarized police state within the Soviet bloc. Okay, so that's where Putin experienced the rise of a civil society, the collapse of his German communism. He was interested. At that moment, deputy chief of station, but in reality, he was the station chief in Dresden. He experienced this as a trauma. I agree with everything Professor Kruglansky said. I would say that Putin also is a person affected, and not only him, by trauma. The trauma of the transformation of the country of his worshipping the center of his political cosmology, the heliocentric, let's say, system, he witnessed the sun ceasing to be the sun. And that resonated very well with the group of people who are behind him, the so-called Silaviki, the people of power who try to restore the glory of Russia, but this is very important, if I may, also the glory of their pockets. This is important to keep in mind. Putin suffered for the humiliation of Russia, but he discovered the great benefits of being a Russian autocrat. And as a Russian autocrat, he put huge amount. People say X is the richest man in Russia. No, Putin is the richest man in Russia at this moment.
Let me remind our viewers, if you have a question for our guests, give us a call at the number on the screen or email livequestions@mpt.org. Let me skip ahead, if I may, to the bottom line question here. How much of Ukraine Russia or Putin wants? Is it a matter of getting Kiev and maybe they stop getting to the river and stop, or are Russian tanks going to wind up on the border with Poland?
Russia has the most volatile idea about borders. It's basically never enough. The problem of Russian insecurity is that it seems to be inexhaustible and, let's say, impossible to domesticate. It has a long history. Professor Kurlansky mentioned here that Putin put the picture of Peter the Great. Peter was a Westernizer. In reality, for Putin, the West means the number of Zara and Levi's and I don't know, Coca-Cola and so on. But the Western model of separation of powers is the least interesting to him. Actually, he execrates, he abhors it. So for Putin, the important thing is a strong nation state dominated almost in a racist way by Eurasian population that he appeals to, combination, because Russia and his geopolitical imagination is Eurasia. And Eurasia is the center of the world. We cannot go now into the geopolitical component of this. So Putin wants to recreate what they call Velika Russia. Ukraine belongs there in this imagination. Ukraine is the small Russia. The little Russia, our
Professor,
younger sister.
If you were email asking if there's a religious purification element to this.
I do not think so. I think that, he's himself not religious to the best of my knowledge. And I think it's primarily a nationalism, this idea of Eurasian empire to restore Russia to being a great player in the international arena. I think that this is what he wants. He wants to, at the least, to install a government in Ukraine that will be dominated by the Kremlin. And maybe this is not enough. Maybe other republics, other Baltic republics, would be next.
I'm going to jump in. I just got another great email question. What can be done by the U.S. and NATO on a psychological basis to compel Putin to withdraw from the Ukraine? And I'll tack on to that, or halt his advance.
I think according to Putin and his propagandists, there was a time after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 where the West could be magnanimous in victory. And the West missed that opportunity. So the idea was that the West would, like in the help that the West extended to Germany and Japan after Second World War, contributed through the Marshall Plan to the development of these countries. The West could have done that to Russia. And in Putin's perception, at least, the West did the opposite. The West denigrated Russia, the West humiliated Russia, the West threatened Russia with NATO, taking in the Eastern Bloc countries into NATO, and increasingly encircling Russia with physical threats. So that opportunity, according to Putin and his propagandists was missed. At this point, it's very difficult to turn the time back. But at that point,
simply by saying Ukraine will never be in NATO, would that flip the switch, or you're saying it's too late?
Can I intervene for a second? Okay, the first thing about religion, I think it was a very good question. Putin masquerades whenever he needs as a very religious person. He has excellent connections to the former KGB informer, currently the Orthodox Patriarch of Russia, Kirill, who refused to recognize the autonomy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Keep in mind, there's a conflict going on between the Russian Orthodox Church that supports Putin and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that supports Volodymyr Zelensky. B, Western Ukraine is Uniate, that means Greek Catholic. It recognized the sovereignty of Rome. It recognized the infallibility of the Pope and all the rest. Western Ukraine was part of Austria-Hungary. Lemberg, the University of Lemberg nowadays, Lviv is one of the oldest in the region, and so on. Okay, so that would be about the religion. So there is clearly a religious component for me as a student of the Ukrainian and Russian political culture. There is a strong component in this direction. Second, does Putin believe in the mythology he is operating with? Not exactly. He is what they call a it's bricolage. He takes this from here, he takes them from there, and he creates at the end a very convenient frame or framework, which is very flexible. If he wants to throw this part, he immediately replaces it with another part. Last point I want to make, because it's often forgotten in the discussion in our country here or in Europe. Putin is aware that in 1994, Boris Yeltsin, not Yeltsin, his family, created Putin to some extent. Okay, Boris Yeltsin agreed with the then president of the United States, Clinton, that Ukraine would give up. So keep in mind, until 1994, Ukraine had nuclear weapons. There were three successors, so to speak, to the Soviet nuclear force, and there were Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Russia, of course. They gave up their military
in exchange,
force.
if I could jump in, for security guarantees, which obviously have expired.
We committed ourselves, the West.
Let me jump to
the security of the borders.
Before I run out of time, let's get to a phone call from Allegheny County. This is Lisa. Lisa, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. Real quick, why has not the European Union or NATO explained the rules and the laws of the European Union or the NATO alliance to the rest of the world, so we all kind of understand why EU and NATO is not involved?
Thanks very much for the call. Is there any ambiguity on EU and NATO and what they stand for?
I think EU is fully involved. We have, as we talk at this very moment, you have, first of all, you have the extraordinary involvement of the EU members, Romania and Poland, to accept refugees and so on. You have, I don't want to go, France has provided immense support. Germany was a little bit less interested in that, and we know why. There are lots of things to be said, but that would require a different show to go into Germany and Russia and so on. So no, I think that NATO has done lots of the things that needed to be done, short of the risk of engaging with an unpredictable actor in the Kremlin into an uncharted territory that can lead to anywhere. Some people say, oh, he would not have used the A-bomb. Probably he would not, because I think, first of all, they would have gotten rid of him, the entourage.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Sorry to cut you off. Professors Tismanyanu and Kruglansky, we greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Slava.
Close. Joining us now for our Your Health segment is Dr. Kevin Cullen, Director of the University of Maryland Marlene and Stuart Greenebaum Comprehensive Cancer Center. Doctors, thank you so much for joining us. President Biden is backing what's called a cancer moonshot. How do you understand what that's going to be and the potential impact for patients?
So what President Biden announced recently is a renewal of the previously funded Cancer Moonshot program. And what he wanted, I think, to emphasize is that the goal is to reduce cancer mortality in the United States by at least 50% over the next 25 years, which I think is a very achievable goal. And so he wanted to really convince everybody that the efforts that we're making are paying fruit and that we need to redouble our efforts to reduce cancer mortality.
Is it one big moonshot, looking for one global cure, or are we looking for a lot of smaller moonshots?
It's really the latter. If you look, the cancer epidemic sort of peaked around 1990, which was right around the time I finished my training at the National Cancer Institute. And since 1990, the combined efforts for better cancer screening, cancer prevention like tobacco reduction, HPV vaccines, as well as improvements in cancer treatments, all of those things combined have added up to a tremendous reduction in cancer mortality. I was part of a study with the American Cancer Society published about 2 years ago, and we showed that between the peak at 1990 and 2035, which was the endpoint of the American Cancer Society, we will have reduced cancer mortality by well over 50%. And if we just do the things that we know how to do, that doesn't mean we need to add any new cures or anything else. If we just keep reducing smoking and get people their cancer screening and make treatments that we know work available to everybody equitably, we'll reduce cancer mortality by as much as 65%. So I think we're making a lot of progress, and people just don't realize that from day to day. And I think that's part of what the White House wanted to emphasize.
Do you think that we might, unfortunately, see an increase in mortality numbers in the next few years because of what's happened during the pandemic, with far fewer people getting routine screenings?
We unfortunately will. It won't be a large increase, but we will see an increase in cancer deaths over the next couple of years. But it will be relatively modest. At the peak of the pandemic, or in the early part of the pandemic, when everybody was on lockdown, cancer screenings went down as much as 75 to 90%. And we're catching up now that the pandemic is loosening and people are getting back to more normal activities. So fortunately, the number of people who weren't diagnosed is going to be going down fairly rapidly. But there's no question that we're going to see several thousand what we call excess cancer deaths. That's what we wouldn't have seen otherwise as a result of decreased screening during the pandemic.
This may be a silly question, but of the early stage cancers that were not caught, is it possible that some of those go away by themselves? Do we have any idea if the body's immune system, having basically missed the early stage of the cancer, not recognized it as an invader in the body, might click in somehow?
That's a great question, and it's absolutely true. We know now that in prostate cancer, for example, a lot of early stage prostate cancers just never become clinically significant. They don't bother the patient. So the ones where we're really concerned about are things like colonoscopies, where we show that we know that they not only diagnose cancers early, but they actually prevent cancers, because at a colonoscopy, you remove a polyp, which is the precursor lesion to going on to getting colon cancer. But there's no question, one of the big breakthroughs in cancer in the last few years has been the understanding that the body's immune system can defeat many cancers. And now a lot of our research efforts and treatment efforts are focused on how do we harness the power of the body's immune system. So just as you said, we know that the body can eradicate cancers at an early stage and even at an advanced stage. So I think you're probably right. We would certainly, be at risk of overdiagnosing some cancers because we know the body's immune system can get rid of them. Not all, because so cancer screening is still very, very important.
And what you're describing is immunotherapy, personalized medicine. If you were directing the Biden administration on where to spend money, would that get a lot of it?
It would get some, no question. But I think what's the other point of the Biden message, if you read it carefully, is, to achieve these goals of 50% reduction in cancer mortality, we don't need new inventions. We don't need new discoveries. Those will be icing on the cake, and we should work towards them. But the biggest strides are made by things that we know how to do and that aren't very expensive, like putting in efforts to prevent tobacco use, preventing youth from becoming addicted to tobacco, getting people to do their screenings. These things are well known and aren't very expensive, but certainly research funding needs to go to the exciting new things like harnessing the body's immune system, immunotherapy, cellular immunotherapy, reprogramming cells and giving them back to patients. Those things are very exciting, but they're also very, very expensive. And the forecasts that show that we can and should reduce cancer mortality by 50% in 25 years don't require that we invent new things that we don't already have.
One of the things the president mentioned was reducing inequities in cancer treatment, cancer care. How can that be done? I know it's something you work on at the University of Maryland Medical System. How can that be expanded globally?
Well, it's a great question and a great point. I mean, we know for a long time that someone who is diagnosed with cancer and has insurance has a much better outcome than someone who's diagnosed with cancer at the same stage, same type of cancer, but doesn't have insurance. So providing access to care is a critical step. Overcoming socioeconomic barriers to care is a critical step. But also what we try and do at the University of Maryland in Baltimore is make care accessible from the point of view of the patient and the neighbor. We want to make sure that the people who live in our community view us as a welcoming place that's going to provide good care. Trust of the caregivers is an important part of health equity.
The research you do at the University of Maryland Medical Center, the Greenbaum Cancer Center, what's the most exciting, promising thing happening right now?
I would say one of the things that's incredibly exciting is the whole area of what's called cellular immunotherapy, where for somebody who has an advanced cancer, you can take their immune cells out, reprogram them in the laboratory, expand them in the laboratory, and put them back into the patient. And we've seen in the last couple of years some really almost miraculous cures of things like lymphoma and leukemia in some patients. And what's really exciting, we're taking that experience and adapting it to more common tumors like lung cancer and colon cancer. And those trials are just starting to roll out. But I think a few years from now, and I tell this to the fellows who are trained or in training now as I was 30 years ago, that the way they will treat cancer in a few years is vastly different than the way I was taught to treat cancer 30 years ago. So I think the understanding that the body has the hardware and the software to cure almost, not every cancer, but many, even very advanced cancers is a very exciting discovery and one that I think we will continue to capitalize on over the next few years.
Talk, if you would, about the role for clinical trials and the importance of that at an institution like yours, where you're trying to move the science forward. You're asking people who have these conditions to sign up, and you really need their help.
Absolutely. It's critically important. Nationally, only about 2% of people with cancer participate in a clinical trial. And why are clinical trials so important? Well, it's the only way we know that a new treatment works is if you test it really rigorously. You have to test it in enough people, and you have to compare it to a group that you've studied very, very carefully to really know for sure whether the new treatment is superior and is an addition to old. And the only way we can do that is with clinical trials. So we really encourage our patients to participate in clinical trials. And at the Greenbaum Cancer Center over the last 5 years, nearly 10,000 patients graciously agreed to participate in clinical trials to contribute their experience with cancer to the people who are going to come down the road. And that's a very, very generous gift that we get from our patients. But without that, we just don't know whether what we're doing is an improvement. But it's also critical because about a third or 40% of our patients are underrepresented minorities, that we get the buy-in of the community and that minority patients also participate in clinical trials, because not every person is alike. Ethnic differences matter in terms of how people respond to drugs, how people with cancer interact with their bodies. So it's really important that people not only participate in clinical trials, but that clinical trials represent the communities that we're trying to serve.
Before we go, we talked a little about screenings that might have been missed during the course of the pandemic, and the recommendations for the big cancers, breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate, where early detection, can be done, can be life-saving. I won't ask you to recite what they are at the moment, but what's the best resource for people to figure out what testing they ought to be getting to
Sure.
stay ahead of things?
There are two websites. There are a number of places where you can find this on the web, but two very good websites are the American Cancer Society website, which is cancer.org, and the National Cancer Institute's website, which is cancer.gov. Both very easy to remember. And if you type in screening, they'll take you right to the screening guidelines. They'll also, especially on the ACS website, give you some places where you can call to help access screening if you don't know how to do it through your own primary care doctor or your own local health facility.
Dr. Kevin Cullen, sir, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that is Direct Connection for this week. Join us every week at this time for your chance to ask the experts. Please follow us on Twitter @MPT News for updates on our future guests and topics. We're back Friday with State Circle, the latest on Maryland politics and the legislative session. Join us Friday at 7. Thanks for watching tonight. Have a good evening.
Your health segments are a co-production of Maryland Public Television and the University of Maryland Medical System.
This program was made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities.